Buddy Ryan became NFL head coach of the Philadelphia Eagles 1 year after Phil Sheridan jumped on the beat. And Phil, of course, has covered the Eagles for a long, long time and has been around Philadelphia Eagles football for a long, long time, Phil. But I got to imagine those couple of years with Buddy Ryan had to be some of the most colorful years that you've had while covering this franchise.
Oh, no question about it. I mean, you're right. The first year I covered them was '85, which was Marion Campbell last year. And Marion was a really nice guy, very, very polite gentleman, Southern gentleman kind of a guy. Didn't say much that you would remember all these years later. And I was like 22 when they fired Marion Campbell and hired Buddy Ryan. And here comes this guy, with this Oklahoma drawl. And, he just said stuff you couldn't believe was coming out of his mouth. And, now I'm older than Buddy was when he got here. So, that kind of puts things in perspective too. But he was a larger than life kind of character, and what kind of made him cool in a way that I think other guys, like a guy like Chip Kelly most recently, didn't quite have, is that even though he was kind of a larger than life character and a very distinguished coach, he loved being around great players and loved to let them do what they wanted to do. He loved being a part of the circus. Like, he liked being the ringleader in the circus, but he liked the circus itself. He liked having the players do their own thing. He loved Jerome Brown being a crazy character and Reggie White doing what he did and Randall Cunningham going off and doing things on the field and off the field. I mean, it was just a very unique time. The team was really, they had gone to the Super Bowl in '80, and then Vermeil kind of went out, citing burnout, and resigned. And the team had just kind of fallen off the map in terms of fan interest and passion. And it all came back under Buddy Ryan. And it was really, it was really quite a colorful and interesting time to be around that team.
Phil, as you wrote in your piece over at ESPN.com, that he achieved legendary status, which is kind of odd for a guy that was 0-3 in the playoffs. But what was it about his impact here that allowed him to be called a legend?
Yeah, it's just the way it turned out. I mean, all the years that Andy Reid was doing really well on the field, you could still hear fans kind of, whether it was on talk radio or just in emails you would get as a reporter, just, he's not Buddy Ryan. It sounded like the days of Buddy Ryan. I miss those days. And it was just that, even though they never won anything, the team was just wildly entertaining. And the thing about Buddy was he didn't, he kind of said things about the owner of the team that were kind of, critical and kind of mocking it at times. When a player had a contract dispute, Buddy sided with the player. He basically, took the player's side in any kind of situation like that, and did not endear himself to the owner and his bosses by doing things like that. But fans love that stuff. And I think the other big factor was that he was a defensive first coach, and he was a bona fide defensive genius as a coach. But also his team was just, it took that personality. It was arrogant, and it was like a bully on the field. It would intimidate teams. There were all these episodes that happened where all kinds of various conflicts and controversies. Bounty Bowl, all these things. The games had names. There was a Bounty Bowl, the Pork Chop Bowl, and the Fog Bowl. I mean, all these things just rose to a higher level of sort of intensity and scrutiny. And it was just a lot of fun to be around. And it got the fan base energized in a way that it carried for a long time. The team that kind of came together under Buddy Ryan kind of vanished kind of by the early to mid-'90s when Reggie White left and Seth Joyner left and Clyde Simmons left and eventually Cunningham left. There was just nothing left of that team by the mid-'90s in terms of players. And, the fans stayed there, and the fans stayed loyal through the railroad era, and they came back in big numbers when the Andy Reid era got going. But that real fire of the passion of the fan base really was lit, I think, during the Buddy Ryan years.
Phil Sheridan, ESPN.com, NFL Nation, covers the Eagles. You mentioned, beforehand, and I know you were only on that beat 1 year beforehand, but what was it like as an Eagles fan? I mean, was the stadium as crazy? I mean, because now that's all we know, that sellouts are just the norm, that team has always been clearly the number one. Was that something that was like that pre-Buddy, or was that something that he recreated?
I think it was pretty, it's pretty passionate during the Vermeil years. In that Super Bowl year, in 1980 and into '81 when they went to the Super Bowl in New Orleans, there was a lot of passion at that point. But it really, when there was a player strike in '82 and Vermeil left, and basically just resigned, said he was burned out and left. And then Marion Campbell, like I said, he was a really good guy and a very good coach in terms of defensive coordinator, but not a really inspiring figure, I would guess you would say. The team just kind of lost its juice at that point. There didn't seem to be a lot of passion. The Sixers won the championship in '83, so that was going on. The Flyers were always still pretty good in that era. Tony Lindbergh came along and was killed pretty much right in the same window there. The Phillies had gone to the World Series and won it in '80, went back to the World Series in '83. So you had a lot of successful teams around. The Eagles kind of fell off a cliff when Vermeil left, and they were probably the fourth best team in terms of their performance in their sport out of the four professional teams. And what I would say, Philadelphia Eagles fans have always been very passionate and loyal. There were TV blackouts occasionally for home games back then. The stadium wouldn't sell out at times. It was a cheerless stadium. Veterans Stadium was not a real attractive place to come see a football game. And when the team wasn't very good, it was pretty hard to get people to kind of want to go there. Later, when the team got good and kind of stayed good for a while, that all kind of came back. But really, it all really began. And it wasn't just Buddy, because remember, in '85 they drafted Randall Cunningham and they signed Reggie White to a contract. They had taken him in the supplemental draft because he was in the USFL at the time, but they brought him over from the USFL, drafted Randall Cunningham. They had Mike Quick at that point, Wes Hopkins. A lot of the guys that became really important players during the Buddy Ryan years were already here when he got here. So, it was starting to kind of turn because of the talent level that was starting to accumulate. But then, with Buddy, it all kind of became a much more heightened thing. It was a bigger show with a lot more drama. Seemed like all the time around everything. And then after he left, pretty soon Jerome Brown got killed in that car accident. Reggie White left over a contract dispute. It was just a lot of that just kind of went away. It was a very, very tempestuous time, and Buddy was right at the center of a lot of it.
Phil Sheridan's with us, and we're sharing some memories about Buddy Ryan. And Phil, Mike and I were talking before you came on about, we can't think of another coach that had games like that, and you mentioned that, games body bag and pork chop bowl and things like that. So of all the games that you covered with Buddy Ryan as head coach, which one stood out as most memorable to you?
Well, Pete, I got to say, the Fog Bowl was such a fascinating, experience overall. I'm still a kid at this point. I'm in my 20s. You go to Chicago for a playoff game. It was like, I think it was New Year's Eve or New Year's Day. I think maybe the game was on New Year's Eve. So it was like, party time in Chicago. The whole city was out. Everything was very lively. You go there, Buddy, brings the team in, and they'd won the NFC East. They looked like a team that could, very, very easily win the game. They seemed like they were poised to do anything at that point. And they were playing pretty well. And then, somewhere early in the second half, the fog you could actually watch the fog. It looked like smoke from a big fire. It just kind of came creeping over the side of Soldier Field and kind of down into the bowl. And just within about 5 or 10 minutes, you couldn't see anything. And all the media up in the press box were allowed to go down on the field because you couldn't see anything from the press box at all. So they just let us go down on the field. But the thing was, you couldn't see anything on the field either. You could kind of sort of make out people across the field from you, but you not really see them very well. Every now and again, you hear footsteps, and like a player would run along the sideline in front of you. It was really very, very surreal and unforgettable. And one of the great things about it that people don't remember, probably didn't even know at the time, was that we went down, after the game, you get to the locker room, you talk to people, you talk to the coaches, and we went back upstairs probably about an hour after the game was over, and there was no sign of fog at all. It left as quickly as it came. It's like it came, sat there for that second half. The Eagles lost the game. If they had won that game under normal circumstances, I think they might have won that game. If they had done that, who knows what Buddy Ryan would have accomplished in Philadelphia. If they had won a playoff game in that first trip to the playoffs, there might have been a couple of Super Bowls, on his list because, they were heading in that direction. After they lost that game, and then they had, kind of a bad loss against the Los Angeles Rams the next year in the playoffs. And by the third year, it was all in their head, we're in the playoffs, what are we going to do? How are we going to get over this hump? And, of course, they lost to Washington in that game, and Buddy was fired the next day. So, but that Fog Bowl game was a combination of almost anything seemed possible with that Eagles team at that moment, and they really kind of came together. The year before they had the strike, Buddy held them together through the strike. They were a much better team in '88, and won their division. Look at a team that could really do something. And then the fog came in, and from then on, everything was kind of downhill.
like the spirit of George Halas or somebody came in and ruined it for the Eagles. So you included a quote from Buddy that I used in my Twitter post today. When he got fired, he said, "I never got fired for winning before." That was his quote, and I put #fired for winning when I tweeted about Buddy Ryan today. So did you have any contact then with him, Phil, after he left the Eagles, and what were those conversations like?
Yeah, he was bitter about being fired. He did not and he had no respect for the owner of the team, and he made that obviously clear. And so he didn't really take it as an indictment of himself when he got fired. He just thought it was another example of the owner of the team not being very shrewd football guy. And that was Norman Brayman at the time. And I went to when he got hired as head coach in Arizona a couple years later. I flew out to Flagstaff where they had their training camp and spent a couple of days out there. And Andre Waters signed with them at that point. And but he was the same. It was like the same character, but in like a really. The guy is a big star in a great TV series where he's it's like Carol O'Connor being Archie Bunker, and then you see him in a different show wearing a different costume or something, and it's a couple shows later, and it just doesn't quite the same. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't, seems like the same guy in some ways, but it doesn't seem like quite the same feel. And he was only there for 2 years, I think, in Arizona, so it didn't really take off there. But he was always supremely confident. I mean, that was one thing about him. He had a swagger about him. I think that's one of the things the fans really like too. He just kind of came in and said, "Hey,
So Phil, did he get fired in your opinion because he didn't win playoff games, or did he get fired because what you mentioned that he did not get along with the ownership? Was that the reason ultimately he was fired, or was he fired because he couldn't win a playoff game?
I think both. I think they fed on each other a little bit. I mean, I think he kept he would go out of his way to find excuses to sort of get under the owner's skin, say things about him. And there was the episode after the '87 season when they had gone 0-3 with the replacement team, and Buddy presented scab rings to George Azar, Joe Woolley, and Harry Gamble, who were the three executives in charge of putting together the replacement team. And they went 0-3, and he finished the season. They would have been in the playoffs if they'd gone 3-0, for example. And he knew that he didn't coach the team. He hated everything about the whole strike thing. But, he kind of, went out of his way to publicly humiliate those guys. And Harry Gamble was president of the team and was Norman Brandon's kind of right-hand man running the team. So that was, the kind of thing he did not have to do things like that. I mean, the fans kind of enjoyed it and got a kick out of it, I think. But that's your boss and guy paying your checks. That probably doesn't help. If he had won playoff games instead of losing those 3 playoff games, if they had gone to the Super Bowl, for example, I think Brandon probably would have just sucked it up and taken the occasional little jibe from Buddy, and it would have been fine with it because business would have been good, the place would have been sold out, and the team would have been successful, and Brandon could have enjoyed that aspect of it. But when you keep poking the bear like Buddy did, and then you keep going out and losing in the playoffs every year and never win a playoff game, and every year kind of ends with sort of disappointment, I think that one led to the other. His constant antagonism toward the owner put the owner in a position where, he couldn't fire him if he was winning. But if he wasn't winning and he wasn't going to win a playoff game, then the owner had every right to do what he did. And ultimately, I remember after that Washington loss, walking around the locker room and really getting a sense from the players that maybe they would have bounced back if Buddy had come back. But I really had a sense that the team just felt like we're doomed. We don't know how to. We can't win in the playoffs. There's something missing. We don't know what to do about it. And when they fired him, and the players, they had basically a fresh start with a new situation. I think the team probably got a little bit of bounce from that. 2 years later, they did win a playoff game. Only playoff game they won, and all that whole era with all those great players. But also ultimately, again, if the fog hadn't rolled in Chicago that day, I really wonder what the story would have been of Buddy Ryan's time in Philadelphia.
31-17 in those final 3 seasons. Buddy Ryan passed away, 82 years old. Phil Sheridan has a great write-up about his time in Philly over at ESPN.com, NFL Nation. Always a pleasure, Phil. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Phil.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.